Hello everybody, welcome to the first video in the series about switching to Linux. Now, we're not going to be going over the reasoning for switching to Linux because often, instead of having one sort of big reason that you can put on a billboard of why you would switch to Linux, there's typically a lot of small reasons that sort of add up over time that allow you to understand why you would want to switch to Linux. So those are kind of hard to sort of get across in a video or even a few videos. So we're going to assume for the sake of this video that you've already made the decision that you want to switch to Linux. So, I mean, we do have this meme to help you figure out why you should change from Windows to Linux. Hopefully this pie chart helps with that. This is actually the exact reason I switched to Linux, because I was thinking about it. I'm like, because I saw some of the stuff you could do with it, and I'm like, it seems pretty cool. I should try it. And then I started to kind of slowly make the transition, still having my Windows machine around so I could use it, to do the stuff that I needed to do homework, do, whatever, watch YouTube. But then Windows just decided that it didn't want to work for me anymore at all, and it would blue screen like every day, and there'd be all sorts of stupid problems that I'd fix and then they'd come right back. But since switching to Linux, I haven't had any of those problems anymore. So one of the most important things I think that a lot of people get wrong when they try to switch to Linux, and that a lot of people who are trying to convince other people to switch to Linux are getting wrong, is that you have to understand what Linux is before you switch to it. You know what I mean? Because a lot of people that try to convince people to switch, they're just like, oh, use Linux, it's better. You do all this stuff with it, it's so much better, just switch. But the person doesn't really understand what Linux is and how to use it, so then they end up not understanding it, not liking it. So it's very important to understand Linux. Okay, and one of the biggest mistakes that people make is that they try to make Linux Windows. And Linux is not like Windows, and that's on purpose. It's fundamentally different than Windows in some respects, in the way that it works. Most of the significant differences are the way that Linux works, sort of more under the hood and more deep down at the program level, and not as much at the user experience level and how you use it. But there are some things that are in Windows that don't really transfer very well to Linux. So if you try to do those things on Linux, a lot of them are theoretically possible to do, but it's not the best way in a lot of cases. So a lot of people will try to be doing Windows things on Linux, and it won't work for them, and then they won't want to use Linux because of that. Another misconception that a lot of people have is that Linux is this super elite operating system that only really good computer users and like people who program for a living and like hackers and stuff can use, because it's just way too complicated for a normal person to use. And that is not the case at all. Thinking that you need to know all the parts, how every part of a computer works to use Linux, is like saying you have to be a professional mechanic to drive a car. If you know about the system that you're using, you can maybe use it in more interesting ways. And that's what a lot of people in Linux like to do. A lot of people that run Linux like to understand it to a fairly deep level and make changes to it and make little scripts and do all this different advanced stuff, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So you can just use it in a similar way that you use Windows. Remember, not exactly the same, but in a similar way where you just install it, use the tools that are there. You don't have to program your own. You don't have to, go into the source code of all your programs and, add all these changes and stuff. You can just use it the way it comes. But one of the most important things is you have to be able to learn something new, because there's going to be a lot of new things, and if you're not willing to learn them and hang in there, then it's not really going to work out. And although there's going to be a lot of differences, there are a decent amount of things that work exactly the way that you're used to them working. You can install Firefox. It's the same Firefox that you can find on Windows or on Mac, Chrome, Discord, Steam. They're all the same, kind of with the exception of Steam, because the Steam application functions the same way, but you won't be able to have as many games, because not as many work on Linux. So if you have a really big Steam library, you may find that a lot of your favorite games might not run on Linux, but we'll get into that later. There's also other programs that will not run on Linux, like Microsoft Office, that have alternatives that work just as well, if not even better, like LibreOffice. But Linux does have its downsides, like anything else does. So let's get into what some of those downsides are. Like I kind of mentioned before with Steam, not every game on Steam is Linux compatible. In fact, there's a majority of them are not, I believe. But Steam does have this thing called Proton, which allows some games that weren't designed to run on Linux, but it's not perfect. It works great for some games, not for others. So depending on how many games you have, what games you like to play, maybe all your games will work on Linux and you can just switch over fine, but maybe they won't. So you'd have to look into that. And especially if you're the type of person that wants to get every new game right when it comes out and play it on day one, you're not really going to be able to do that with Linux. Because some developers make their games Linux compatible, like out of the box, but these days I believe still a lot of them don't. So you're not going to be able to play Cyberpunk right out of the gate, when it finally comes out in 2077 on day one, I don't think, because I don't believe CD Projekt Red makes native Linux things. You can try to run it with Proton on day one, but there's no guarantee to how well it will run. Personally, most of the Steam games that I play work fine with Proton, but I mostly have older games, not like super duper old games, but like I have games like Don't Starve, the original Watch Dogs, which doesn't work on Linux because it has anti-cheat, but anti-cheat that doesn't work on Linux. But most of the games I play on a regular basis, like Minecraft and Life is Strange, technically runs on Linux, but I run it on Windows because I don't run a version that is officially supported by the game, and I was getting some weird graphical issues, so I play it on Windows. But so yeah, if you game every now and again, then Linux will be fine. But if you're a hardcore gamer, I would stick with Windows. And then there's Adobe software. Adobe software does not work on Linux. So no Creative Cloud. If you're paying for that, then you should either consider canceling it or consider not switching to Linux, because it's not going to work. And as far as alternatives go, there's not really a lot of good alternatives for the Creative Cloud on Linux, as far as I know. I'm not a Creative Cloud user, so I don't really have the need to find alternatives. So I didn't look super hard to see how many are out there. But from what I checked, there's not too many. For Photoshop, though, you can get GIMP, which will allow you to edit photos and make memes or whatever, do silly Photoshops and put them on r/Photoshop battles. But if you're a real professional Photoshop user and you know all the tips and tricks and all the fancy things that Photoshop can do, from what I understand, GIMP doesn't do those things. I haven't used Photoshop very much, but every feature that I've used in Photoshop is in GIMP, but obviously there's quite a lot of Photoshop features that I probably have never even heard of in my life, so I can't attest to whether those are in GIMP. And from what I hear from people who know Photoshop inside and out, GIMP is far from having all the features that Photoshop does. But if you don't need 8 million different advanced Photoshop tools and you just want like cropping and, basic stuff, GIMP will do fine. For the other Creative Cloud applications, you're going to be a little bit more pressed to find alternatives to those. Blender and some other software that I forgot the name of. I think Natron is one. You can use to make special effects, but it's not really a replacement for After Effects. I think Blender, you technically can probably do all the stuff you can do in After Effects, but it's just a completely different workflow. So if you already know After Effects and you spent a lot of time learning it, it wouldn't really make sense to try to transition to Blender. And Natron, which I used one time, I don't really know how that works. I don't know how it compares to After Effects, but I have a feeling probably not very well. If you like to edit video, that's a pain in the balls on Linux. I don't know what it is about video editing on Linux. Just most of the video editors that I've used are just really bad. And there's like a couple of different video editors that people are like, oh, use Kdenlive or use OpenShot, use like this other thing. It works great. And I've had bad experiences with like every Linux video editor. I would really honestly rather edit my videos in Windows Movie Maker than anything that that Linux has to offer. With the exception of DaVinci Resolve. DaVinci Resolve is actually a really good video editor. I used it on Windows for a while before I switched. It does work on Linux, but depending on what version of Linux you're using, it may not work as well. I used Ubuntu in the beginning. I don't recommend using Ubuntu, but I heard it was a good distro to start with, which is a lie. Don't believe it. So I used that for a while, and DaVinci Resolve worked okay on that, from what I remember. But on the distro that I'm using now, which is Arch, doesn't really work as well. The window like wouldn't size to the correct size, and the format compatibility on it is like not as good as it is on Windows. So similar to the Photoshop GIMP thing, if you edit videos every now and again, or you do basic video edits, nothing too fancy, just cuts and stuff, then you can do that on Linux. But if you're like a Premiere Pro expert and you do all sorts of advanced video editing stuff, Linux may not be the platform for you unless there's some crazy awesome video editor out there that I just missed. And like I said before, Linux has a pretty big learning curve. You're not going to just switch overnight. You need to put a bunch of time and effort into making the switch. And another thing is that a lot of people will knock Linux for stuff that isn't Linux's fault because they don't understand Linux and how it works. Basically, one of the main things that people will complain about with Linux is compatibility with certain things like software or hardware. And that stems from that software being proprietary. which that means that the person or the company that made that software, or the hardware that that software works with, like a driver or something, chooses to keep how that works a secret. They keep the source code to themselves and they don't share it. Meaning that if they don't make a version for Linux, then there won't be a Linux version. So, but a lot of people will blame Linux as if it's Linux's fault that Adobe didn't choose to make a Linux version of the Creative Cloud, or it's Linux's fault that back in the day, NVIDIA drivers were really hard to work with on Linux, or that, you know, it's Linux's fault that it can't use the fingerprint sensor on their laptop, when it's actually because the manufacturer of the fingerprint sensor just never made software that works on Linux. So it's important to know what things are the fault of Linux and what things are the fault of proprietary software. Because once people start to see that these problems that they complain about are actually caused by these big companies and not Linux itself, then maybe people will actually try to get these companies to change. I don't know how well that's going to work, but it's worth a shot. Another thing that a lot of people don't seem to get when they first switch to Linux, or first try to, is that there's a lot of different versions of Linux. There's a lot of different configurations. You know, unlike Windows, where you go to the store and you get a computer and it's got Windows 10 on it, and that's Windows. That's the only version of Windows other than the older ones that aren't supported anymore. And you open it up and it looks how it looks. You can change some stuff. You can change the background. You can change what side of the screen the taskbar is on. You know, you can change what color some of the UI elements are. But that's pretty much how Windows works. And there's only one version. Mac is a similar thing, but with Linux, you can change all sorts of stuff. There's all sorts of different versions and different programs to do different things, different tools. And basically, to do any given thing on Linux, there's a ton of different ways to do it and a ton of different programs to do it with. So if you use a certain version of Linux or a certain Linux tool and you don't like the way that it works, or you don't like how the GUI of one distro looks, that's not all of Linux. You can change to a different version. You can get a different package manager, get a different GUI, a different mail client, a different whatever. And basically all of Linux in a lot of cases is modular. So that offers the upside of having an enormous amount of customizability to get your system exactly the way you want, but that also means that there's a lot of different systems and configurations and stuff that you might have to go through before you find one that you really like. So it could take more time to really make a switch to a system you like, because unlike Windows or Mac, where you just go and you're like, oh, this is the system, this is where everything is, I just have to learn it and get used to it. On Linux, you can actually choose all those things, and it's kind of a double-edged sword of you have all these options, but now that you have all these options, you now have the challenge of choosing which one. So on the subject of the different versions of Linux, here is a big, huge SVG file that shows just some of the many different types of Linux that there are. Each one of these dots is a Linux distribution, and you'll see that there's tons and tons and tons of them. Now don't get too overwhelmed, because most of these are not really versions of Linux that you would typically use. A lot of these Linux distributions are specialized for certain things. Let's see, like this one here, Parrot, is for security testing and stuff like that. Raspbian is for Raspberry Pis, which means that this line, all these OSs off of this line are also for Raspberry Pis, so you don't have to worry about that. Open Media Vault, just from the name, sounds like something that you would put on like a media server or something. What you really want to look at is like the sort of beginnings of these trees, because these are the more sort of main Linux distros. These would be the ones that you would actually most likely pick from, or some ones that are based off of them. Don't use this to pick what Linux distro you want to start with. Don't use this picture because a lot of these you don't want to start with. But I'm just showing you this so you can see just how many different types of Linux distros there are, to illustrate the point that of how varied it is. But typically these ones over here, Debian, Slackware, let's keep going, Arch, where's Gentoo? Oh, Gentoo is somewhere. Gentoo, Fedora, those are the distros that you would probably choose. Fedora would be like here somewhere. It's based off of Red Hat. Red Hat, CentOS. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. No, okay, that's CentOS, whatever. But yeah, not to get too sidetracked. But yeah, there's lots and lots of different options. So in the next episode of this series, we're going to go over how to pick a Linux distro to start with. Now remember, not necessarily one to go with the whole time. You might pick your first distro and then later decide that you don't really like it and you want to switch to a different one. I would advise against doing that too much, but you might need to go through a couple to find the one you want. So we will go over that in the next episode.